A week after America's Super Bowl, it's another showdown of sorts. Valentine's Day, a time for romance, and for many, a lesson in the high price of romantic gestures. As you're about to hear from a Hoover Institution economist, surviving Valentine's Day is the easy part. It's what comes after the romance, a lifetime commitment and raising Rugrats that grows ever more complicated. We'll find out why in this heartfelt installment of Matters of Policy and Politics. It's Wednesday, February the 11th, 2026, and you're listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a podcast devoted to the discussion of Hoover Institution policy research and issues of local, national, and geopolitical concern. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Hoover Institution's Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism. I'm not the only fellow who's doing podcasts these days. You should go to our website and check it out yourself. That is hoover.org/podcast. You'll find just a whole gamut of topics we cover. It also includes the audio version of the Goodfellows broadcast that I have the great honor of moderating. This podcast is being released on Friday the 13th, a curious date in that it's a number many of you either love or loathe, depending on whether you worship the altar of Taylor Swift, whose lucky number is 13, or you suffer from a bad case of triskaidekaphobia, which is, of course, the fear of the number 13. It's also one day before February the 14th, which, of course, is Valentine's Day. Here to talk a little bit about the economics of Valentine's Day and a lot more about love and family, where romance ultimately takes us. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast Valerie Ramey. Valerie Ramey is the Hoover Institution's Thomas Sowell Senior Fellow, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a professor emeritus at UC San Diego. She co-leads the Hoover Institution's Economic Policy Working Group and participates in Hoover's Long Run Prosperity Working Group. She's the author of an essay you want to check out. It's on Hoover's Substacks page. It's called Do Stimulus Packages Work? I asked her to come on this podcast because she's written extensively on the raising of children in modern times, and that's our connection to Valentine's Day. Assuming love blossoms into commitment, commitment leads to parenthood. What comes after that? Valerie, great to see you. I'm going to warn you, I am not a Valentine's Day person. Are you a Valentine's person?
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me on the show. Valentine's Day is fine, but I find that ritual a little redundant since we kind of cover those bases on our anniversary, my husband and me. But I am wearing my pink jacket in honor of Valentine's Day.
Very good. You mentioned your husband. Tell us how you and your husband met, because you both are academics. You're both economists, right?
Yes. So my husband Gary and I met when on the debate circuit. I just graduated from high school and was teaching at a debate institute for the summer. And then he was the guest lecturer on tertiary oil recovery, since the topic that year was energy. Okay. So with that romantic start, I lured him to my university. We were at different ones then. And then we became economists together, went to graduate school together at Stanford, and then had careers at UCSD. He retired, but I came up here, and so I commute back and forth.
So what do economists do on Valentine's Day if they go out on a date, Valerie? Do they talk economics? Do they look at the price of everything? Do they talk about Milton Friedman and Arthur Laffer? How exactly would you celebrate it?
Well, so we might talk about economics, but we're also interested in politics and history and literature. So we're going to celebrate this Valentine's weekend. First of all, we both love the theater. We both love Ibsen, and the Hedda Gabler is playing with Katie Holmes in it at the Old Globe in San Diego. So that is our Valentine's weekend fun. Plus, we're going to have a nice French dinner.
So it sounds like your advice for couples on Valentine's Day is do something you both enjoy, kind of find your sweet spot and lead into it.
Absolutely. And often chocolate is accompanying this because that's also our sweet spot.
Boy, speaking of chocolate, Valerie, I was in the grocery store yesterday getting my provisions, and I happened to walk by, one of the many stands that are strategically located in the grocery store trying to get you to buy chocolate, either for the love of your life or just to get you through the day. If you don't have such love, you would not believe the price of Hershey's Kisses right now, like $20 a bag.
Wow. So we actually have chocolate that we received for Christmas presents. So we did have that. I think prices were lower then.
Yeah. So Valerie, I have in my office here a very tongue-in-cheek column that I framed. It's called Why I Hate Christmas, and I'm not a Christmas fan myself, and so I just love this column. It was written about 35 years ago and appeared in the New Republic, written by an economist named James Henry, and it's satirical. It just he points out that he grew up in a big Midwestern family, but as he's grown older, he's realized that in his idea, Christmas is what he calls a failed socioeconomic institution. In fact, here's a quote. Let me read it to you. Quote, "Modern Christmas is like primitive Keynesianism, a short-run oriented economic experiment that has been tried and found wanting." Boy, bah humbug. But could you say the same about Valentine's Day?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Valentine's Day is a smaller holiday. It's a nice ritual. I mean, so cognitive neuroscientists and anthropologists actually have researched rituals, and it turns out rituals are really important for mental health and social connections. So I think back when I was more of an academic, bah humbug kind of person, I thought sort of not as bad as that person. I always like Christmas, but then I actually realized as I've grown older the importance of rituals. And often when you're young, you wonder why you have to go through them, but it's a good thing. Remembering why you love your spouse, is a good thing.
Mhm. So, a little economics about Valentine's Day, Valerie. This is courtesy of the National Retail Federation. It estimates that Valentine's Day consumer spending will reach about 29.1 billion with a B billion dollars this year. That would be a record. It would surpass 27.5 billion in 2025. It guesses that shoppers are going to be targeting about $200 per gift. Interesting price range, if you will. This is obviously very good news for florists. I think something like 250 million roses are sold on Valentine's Day. Also, Saturday is the busiest day for florists in general. Restaurants, Valerie. National Restaurant Association reports that nearly 40% of Americans will celebrate Valentine's Day after the fact, getting a better deal. Now, this fascinates me as somebody who goes out on dates because I don't think dating somebody is a positive sign early in a relationship to say, I really enjoy your company, but let's go out 2 days after Valentine's Day because we'll get 20% less on the entree. That tells me a lot of married couples are doing this.
Yes, yes. So once you're married, you can do what economists call intertemporal substitution, uh, uh, to do something when the price is lower. So say you would, naturally go out to dinner at certain times. So if you're on the romantic part, the trick is to go out on Valentine's Day because then you have this ritual also associated with it. But then once you're married, you can say, let's do it a few days in advance or a few days afterwards, and then you still can do your own little ritual, but you don't have to pay such a high price.
And for the record, you've been married, what, 38, 39,
Oh
40
no,
years?
40. I think it's going to be 45 years this summer.
45. So you know
Yes,
of what you speak.
yes, I know what I'm talking about.
When you were growing up, Valerie, did you get those little tiny sweetheart candies on Valentine's Day? There was a
Oh
little message on
yes,
them.
I just love those. And then, how we had to give Valentines to our entire class because you never wanted to leave somebody out. We all read Peanuts and Charlie Brown didn't get Valentines. So we all made sure to give everybody Valentines because we wanted no Charlie Brown left out.
Yeah, my sister has four little grandsons between the ages of 10 and 7. So I've been watching how they approach Valentine's Day,
Uh,
and they have no interest in girls right now. Girls are the enemy right now. That'll change soon, I imagine. But two things I've noticed in their class. One is Valentine's Day is very, very inclusive. Everybody has to get a card for what you just mentioned. Nobody wants to be Charlie Brown. But secondly, Valerie, they're taking away all pretenses of gender and just identity. And so, in other words, I can't give you a football card because, boys play football and girls don't necessarily. In other words, they just want to take the whole boy girl thing away from it.
I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And also, I mention this because also we go back to our friends who make the sweethearts candies. Those messages used to be things like "Marry me" and "Be my Valentine" and stuff. The newest batch that's come out, Valerie, let me read a few slogans to you. One reads, "Love in this economy." You can appreciate that. Another one reads, "Split rent." Another one reads, "Share login." Another one reads, "Carpool." Another one reads, "Buy in bulk." Another one reads, "Cook for two."
So maybe one can see why marriage rates are going down.
Well, that's not romantic, is it?
No, it isn't. It isn't,
Okay, I want to turn to your knowledge of stimulus economics, Valerie, and ask you a rather naive question. I think this is not a holiday, Valentine's Day. It's a day on the calendar, but it's a day that kind of is, engages in social engineering because it drives people into doing economic activities. I have to go out and buy chocolates or roses, or I have to take somebody out to the theater or restaurant and things like that. In other words, you could say it's good for the economy. It's a stimulus. So my question, Valerie, is why don't we have one of these every week to get people out and spending money? I mean, you
Okay,
could you
so
could you could have Valentine's Day, you could have, National Divorcee Day one day, you could have, First Child Day. Just you could go on each week and find some reason for people to part with their money.
well, it wouldn't work. So let me tell you that
Why?
because typically what it does is it leads people to bunch things they are likely to already do. So for example, for Christmas, we tend to save up the sort of luxury fun things to put on our Christmas list for our relatives to give us because it's just fun for everybody to be opening presents. But if we didn't have Christmas, we would probably buy them for ourselves earlier. So the total amount of spending isn't as high as you see just by the big peak in spending at Christmas. It's just that we've intertemporally substituted away from other times to a time when it's fun to do it. And it's the same thing with Valentine's Day. Chances are that the monthly or whatever dinner out at a restaurant just gets moved to Valentine's Day because then it's more festive. It's actually fun to celebrate things when other people are doing it, of course, as long as it doesn't get too crowded, because sometimes that can take away the fun. But the other thing is, I think this is not economics, but just basic psychology. There is a fatigue effect with these sorts of things. And if you had too many of them, then you just start ignoring them all. It's sort of like those signs in California that's saying that this is known to cause this chemical is known to cause cancer. What's the last time that you paid attention to that sign? Again, it's the fatigue effect.
That crossed my mind when I was buying cigars in the Caribbean recently. I went on vacation. You buy the little box of cigars, and there's in huge letters, "This will cause cancer." Okay, duly noted.
Right.
I think you're right about the fatigue thing. One thing in this country, there is a national day every day for something. And at some point, the cynic in you, the crusty person in you says, do we really have a national day for this? Are we running out of things to have a national day?
Yes. No, absolutely.
Okay. Pamela, explain to me this thing called the K-shaped economy.
Yeah, so this is the idea that people in a higher socioeconomic category are really making good progress. Their incomes are going up, their prosperity is going up, whereas there are other groups of people, typically less educated or less healthy, whose incomes are stagnating or going down. So that's the spreading apart that people talk about, the K economy.
Okay. Is Valentine's Day a K-shaped event?
Well, so K-shape is talking about over time. So I would say on average, I suspect that higher income people spend more on Valentine's Day. The question is that diverging? I'm not sure. But one thing that's diverging is getting into what happens after Valentine's Day is marriage rates. So for example, for 45-year-old women, those who are college educated, 71% of them are married. But for non-college educated women, only 52% are married by that age. So there's and that is spreading apart over time. So there is a K-shape in marriage rates.
Can you expand a little bit on the marriage question? Because this is very complicated. This obviously ties into the fact that, women in particular have career options they didn't have 20, 30 years ago. This ties into obviously that people are looking to marry later in life, that you can be 35 or 40 years old and not be maybe as much a stigma. Remember the Mary Tyler Moore show came on in the early 1970s, and this is hugely controversial because, oh my gosh, Mary is single. She's a spinster. What's wrong with her? But you would not bat an eyelash at this day. And it's also that, especially here in the California Bay Area, I can't tell you how many friends I have, they're single moms, and they're single moms by choice. They didn't find somebody by the age of 35 or 40, and they just decided to go on their own. And society, unlike say what Dan Quayle did years ago with Murphy Brown, society today does not, cast scorn upon them.
Yes. So one of the interesting things is what we call sort of mating, which is college educated women are more likely to marry college educated men and vice versa, and less educated women. So if you look at household income, that's something else that's leading to a spreading out because you have two high wage earners in one household and two lower wage earners in another household. But then the other thing is that you have a much higher incidence of single mothers raising children for less educated women. So in fact, an interesting fact is that for the more educated people, they look much more traditional. They're much more likely to get married. They're much more likely to raise kids with what Melissa Carney calls the two-parent privilege, where they have both their father, the child has both his father and his mother there raising them. So there's a big difference there, and that's leading to some of these issues of income mobility. The kid who's raised by two parents, all of the statistics say they have a big advantage, and then college educated parents have more resources to give to those kids, and then that's leading to increased inequality among the children.
There's one other consequence of all this, Valerie, perhaps, and that is fertility. So back in 1960, Valerie, America's fertility rate, this is the average number of children a woman expected to have, was about 3.6. In 2022, it fell to 1.6. So what happened?
So that's a really good question. And there are many economists and demographers studying this right now. So the replacement rate you need to have a fertility rate of 2.1 just to
Mhm.
replace the current population. All right.
Right.
We're at 1.6. All right. What that means is with no changes, the US population would start shrinking. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office projections, I just looked at their latest projections, they project that the native-born population of the US will start shrinking after 2030. That's 4 years from now, because births are too low relative to deaths. The only thing that will keep population above water level or growing is actually net immigration. So if immigration is cut off, we're going to see the US population declining. Japan has already led the way on this. But by the end of this century, I think there'll be half as many Japanese as there were at the beginning. Korea's population is shrinking. China's population is shrinking, but not just there. Latin America, Colombia's fertility rate collapsed. In most places outside of Muslim countries, the fertility rate is declining dramatically.
But if you talk about America going from, say, 330 million people, Valerie, to 310 million people, what's
Mhm.
the real difference?
Yeah, well, the difference is that first of all, there's what we call the compounding problem. So just to give you an idea, suppose that the fertility rate drops to 1%, which is what it is in China.
Mhm.
So Chad Jonas has looked at this. I'm trying to remember the numbers. That means that 100 years from now, we would have millions of people on the earth rather than billions of people. Okay, so we're talking about big numbers, or down into hundreds of
Right.
millions. We're not at 1% yet. But the other thing is the age structure, the age pyramid.
Mhm.
All right. If you are not having children, let's do this in a complete blunt economic sense.
Yes.
You are not producing the workers of tomorrow. Now, the government can promise you all the Social Security you want, but if there aren't any workers to produce the goods and services, that money is nothing. It would just lead to inflation. Prices would keep going up because there would be all of these checks chasing very few goods. The other thing is that older people need services a lot, particularly medical services and caregiving services, right? So we're going to talk about child care, but adult elderly care is going to become more and more important, and that can be very, very expensive. Um, a recent paper came out in the NBR Working Paper series that looked at areas that had higher net migration in the US,
Mhm.
and they found that the health of elderly people was better in those areas after you got a surge in migrants, because you had people that drove down the wages of caregivers, but enough so that people could afford them at the nursing homes, in the home, and all of those sorts of things. So the issue is, um, fine, don't have children, but if you don't, plan to work until you're 75 or 80, because there aren't going to be any other workers there.
Right.
You cannot retire, at 60, the way it was traditionally for people who had lots of children, and therefore ensured that there were workers for the future.
Valerie, years ago, the comedian Conan O'Brien gave this just brilliant commencement address at Dartmouth, and he was making jokes about several things. And one joke he made about was about aging boomers who refuse to leave their jobs. And what he was making a tongue-in-cheek reference to is the fact that Jay Leno would not leave the Tonight Show when it had been promised to Conan O'Brien. But he had a point also that aging boomers, and keep in mind, tread lightly here, you're talking to an aging boomer. Aging boomers are hanging around longer than they used to. So isn't this already kind of a problem in the US workforce where if it's not too top heavy in the elderly are not necessarily stepping aside to the younger generation?
So more workers is always a good thing.
Oh, okay.
Um, that the capital increases. So this, in the short run, you might say, oh, there's a little crowding out, but
Right.
not overall. It's healthy to have a good inflow of young workers, but also to have senior workers there that have a lifetime of on-the-job experience. So this moving aside it's kind of like people who say, oh, we shouldn't have adopted the tractor in farming because so many farm workers, lost their jobs. I mean, we're much better off because of the tractors and farming, because then now workers can work elsewhere. The thing is that we have, and the US is pretty good at this, at reallocating workers to good, better productivity. If there's a higher labor supply, then you tend to get more job creation. And in fact, that's what's could be happening with the labor market recently. All the big surge in immigration over the last, over the previous years led to more job creation and more hires. And now with, a lot of the expulsions and just people not coming in, that could be why job creation is lower.
All right, so the end game here, Valerie, is to get this fertility rate from 1.6, where it is right now, back up to, I think you said 2.1 is the number.
Yeah.
So how do we do this?
So again, all of these academic conferences are looking at so far they figured out what doesn't work.
Right.
Subsidizing doesn't work. Even subsidizing childcare doesn't seem to work much. Various places have, Russia did this, I remember way back, trying to pay people to have children. Just doesn't seem to work. I mean, part of it is the culture. Part of it is, so one big question that we need to answer, and people are trying to do some more research on this, to what extent is the decline in fertility people who wanted to delay childbearing because of career reasons,
Right.
and then believe some false promises about how modern technology can help you have children later in life. The various methods are not nearly as effective as people think. And so quite a few people said, geez, I wish somebody had told me that this wasn't a panacea, that they can often fail, and now it's too late, and now I don't have children. So part of it could just be learning, and then part of it can be culture. It's really fun to have children if all your friends have children. But if your friends aren't having children, then you kind of get into a social life where children aren't included. And so then you could have what economists call multiple equilibria. So certainly, during the baby boom era, everybody had kids. The streets were running with kids. Social activities were organized around kids. And now it's more, adults only kinds of things. So if you could have a change in culture, you might have an increase in fertility.
You could, but the timeline is curious. Now, getting back to the little grandboys, I remember grandsons I mentioned, their mothers, my sister's two daughters, they both got married in their 30s, or actually, excuse me, one got married in her late 20s, but she didn't have a child until I think about 6 years later. So she was in her mid 30s. The other one, who is made to have children, she's a teacher. She loves people. She's a nurturer by nature. She didn't get married until she was 32, and she had a child 2 years later. So they both have had two boys, so they're just shy of the 2.1 mark. I don't know how you have 1/10 of baby. They're 2.0, so let's say they're doing their bit. But the point is, it didn't happen for them until the mid-30s, but in part because of what you just mentioned, Valerie. By the time they're getting to the mid-30s, they'd found that all their college buddies, all their sorority sisters, all the people they tailgated with and gone on all kinds of debauching trips with, they all were settling down with kids.
Yes.
So I guess the question is then, how do you speed that timeline up maybe 5 years, and maybe also try to encourage people to have a third child? But again, now we get in economics, because in the case of these two girls, they're very middle class. Having a third child becomes much more complicated, especially when it comes to the cost of college.
Yes. So when I talked to Milton Friedman one time at a lunch here at a conference, he had a great idea, and I'm hearing that some of that idea is sort of catching on among some groups. He said that the research at that time figured out, people, the creative productivity, people said, oh, it declines with age.
Mm-hmm.
But that research actually said it was relative to when you got your degree, not your chronological age.
Oh.
So he suggested the following strategy for women, because let's be clear, women are the ones who do the childbearing, and even with very helpful fathers,
Right.
it's harder on women. So he suggested that women go to college, because that's very important for the marriage market, right? You want to marry your college sweetheart, say like I did, and then you start having children. The husband would go out and work, and the woman would then start having children. And then once the children are old enough, say high school, then she would go back and get her advanced degree, PhD, medical degree, whatever, because life expectancies are so long now. Then she can have many, many decades of a good career. And I think that's a very interesting idea. So
But life gets in the way of getting that degree, doesn't it?
later on, well, not necessarily. I mean, people can, one of the things, so I know several who went back later.
Hmm.
And part of it was because they were married to people in that profession.
Hmm.
So they kind of, you know, opted out for a while, but then it was easier for them to get back in because they were keeping up with it through their spouse.
All right, so let me throw one more curveball at you,
Mhm.
Dr. Ramey. What happens to college professors, people like you? Where are the PhDs going to be? Are universities going to be, short of teachers if we do this strategy?
Oh, it's a big thing. Now, until recently, there was great demand from foreign students. So,
Right.
but of course, even though China's population is decreasing, there are still 1.3 billion people over there. So demand from foreign students can be great. But given the geopolitical kind of factors, it's not clear what demand will be in the future. But that's going to be a big thing. And in fact, this is what happened in the early 1990s. There was a baby bust in the early 70s, and the result was that it was much easier to get into even Yale and Stanford in the early 90s because there weren't as many high school graduates. In fact, in the study that my husband Gary and I did on the Rugrat race, this was one of our prime explanations for certain patterns, is that was low. And then there was a recovery from that. There were more high school graduates in the US. And then on top of that, there was an increased propensity to go to college.
Mhm.
That led to what we call cohort crowding, which is you have more people trying to get into colleges. Now, some colleges expanded, new colleges came up,
Right.
but what the research showed is that the more prestigious the college, the less likely they were to add slots. So the Ivies Plus hardly increased the number of slots at all, even while there was this big increase in the demand for slots at college, both domestically and then, of course, with the foreign students coming over. So you started getting what we call this Rugrat race to get your kid into college. Whereas before, if you were well to do, you had a pretty good chance of getting your kid, maybe if not in the Ivies Plus, one of the very nice liberal arts colleges if you had the money for it, or one of the flagship colleges like such as we have in in the University of California.
One last question about Milton Friedman before we get into Rugrat Race.
Mhm.
How old were you, Valerie, when you taught your first college course?
Oh goodness. So
Twenties?
I was a teaching assistant here at Stanford
Mhm.
in the 1980s, and then I started as a professor in 1987 at UCSD. So
All right. You were young.
I was young.
Under the Friedman plan, would not universities be lacking for young female professors if women are waiting until later in life to get their PhDs?
That could be, yes. But not every,
Yeah.
this is what I'm saying here. I'm not saying a wholesale
Right.
shift,
Right.
kind of thing. And I actually, I went and got my PhD, and then I had our first child in the summer after my second year as an assistant professor.
Mhm.
So at age 29, so I was kind of young by today's standards.
Okay.
And then my second one in my 30s.
Uh-huh. And I know you have at least one kid who went to Stanford, right?
Yes, yes. And then our son went to Stanford, our daughter went to Berkeley. So
Right.
two of
So
the great
you've run the Rugrat race twice. I've tried saying Rugrat race three times. You've run the race twice, and I would say you succeeded very well by getting the. But do you have a house divided flag, by the way?
No, fortunately, our daughter isn't into football, so it's okay.
Okay, that's good. Right.
Otherwise,
Well, let's talk about the Rugrat race here. So this is something that you and your husband got into. Was it simple, Valerie? Is you and your hubby had moved to San Diego and you saw this phenomenon of children being raised and the race to college? Is that what triggered this?
that's what triggered it. So that paper we wrote was semi-autobiographical.
Mhm.
The Yeah, our first neighborhood, because trying to afford a house even in San Diego at that time. In our first neighborhood, it was mostly an immigrant neighborhood. There were a lot of non-college educated parents, and we had moved into there in 1988. So that was the time when this mania hadn't come about. Plus, we were in a less educated neighborhood.
Right.
Then in 1998, we moved to our current neighborhood where we still live, which was much more educated. Plus, things had changed over time. And we couldn't believe this preparing the child's college resume with after school activities thing. We thought, oh, well, if you get good grades and do well on your standardized tests, it should be fine. We're professors, we know this. And people said, oh, no, no. And we heard all of these sorts of things. So I'm much more sensitive to social signals than my husband is. And so then I said, okay, we've got to, they've got to have this, they've got to have that. And some of them they like our daughter loved horseback riding. But then I'd say, oh, maybe we should do this camp. I hear Johnny's in that camp. And then my son and my husband finally pushed back and said, my son says, I don't want to be overcamped in the summer. I want to have fun doing things in the summer because he's very, very creative. He did Legos and he liked to read a lot and had liked to play with friends. And so they pushed back and I said, okay, and as somebody else said, foot dangling time is really important. And where you just have time to yourself to do whatever you want. And I think that's where you can be the most creative. And I thought about this when I was growing up. We were all free range kids. And then I grew up in the Panama Canal Zone and the American Armed Forces Radio and Television Network. The TV didn't come on until 4 p.m. There were no cartoons on weekends. And so we all went out and played. And that was a good thing. So then I was convinced. It wasn't too hard to convince me. And it turned out really great. Like our son, who was just always loved building things. So he did all of these projects in the garage with his friends and made trebuchets. He was very into medieval battles. And in fact, and then he did leadership at our church, which was a block away. He knew we hated driving our kids to too many things. And so they accommodated us on that. And he just did really well. And his acceptance letter from Stanford, they said, you won't have to use your parents' garage anymore to do your projects. You can use our labs. And I thought that was just a lovely thing.
That's wonderful. Now, Valerie, blessed of those who don't have to worry about this situation. The big news here at Stanford yesterday, for example, was that Charlie Woods is not coming to Stanford. Charlie Woods is Tiger Woods' son.
Oh,
He's apparently quite a golfer himself. Tiger Woods, of course, played golf at Stanford for 2 years. But Charlie is going to Florida State because they have a good golf program, and he is more of kind of a Southeastern kid than a California kid. So there you are. But the point is, I think Tiger has a daughter who already goes to Stanford, and I got a sneaky suspicion that if Charlie Woods wanted to come here, Valerie, unless he was just the least intelligent man on the planet, which I doubt he is, I got a sneaky suspicion he would get in here and be allowed to at least try out for the golf team. So college, not a problem for the Woods family, but for a lot of people it is concern. But here's what I'm curious about, Valerie. So I'm a child of the 70s ultimately, and I think to the extent that I first looked at college and my parents looked at college, I think it was about a 10th grade issue because they were thinking about, okay, 10th grade now, you better get your act together because that's when they're going to look at grades. And so think about extracurriculars and all that. The point is, my parents were not thinking when I was in 6th grade what I needed to be doing in terms of embellishing my resume for college or even earlier than that. So I know there's no magical date when society kind of changed this way, but your estimation, though, when did we really start turning the curve, though, when we started thinking about college, not just a couple years out for kids, but even, a decade or 15 years out?
Yeah, it was again during the 1990s. So
Yeah.
one of the things that we pulled together a bunch of evidence to try to explain why, particularly college-educated parents were dramatically increasing the time they spent on childcare, even
Yes.
though overall they were having smaller families. And the fact that because college-educated parents were earning high wage premium for their college education,
Right.
that what we call the opportunity cost of their time was great, right? You could do some extra consulting, or you could stand there on the soccer field watching your kid play soccer. So we went through a whole bunch of the standard explanations and just ruled them out. Like the crime rate had actually dropped. It was high in the early 90s. It was dropping over time.
Okay.
There's higher income levels. We found once you controlled for college, income didn't matter, a variety of those things. But what we felt, again, autobiographically, was that it was this pressure. It was chauffeuring kids was a big part of this increase in time spent on childcare. And that, not the only part, but something that we certainly noticed. And that this was happening because of this panic to get into good colleges. And so then we pulled together a bunch of evidence. So first of all, this trough and then this increase in the number of kids trying to get into college, and then the colleges not responding, at least the top ones, by increasing their supply. And so our argument was the following. Before the late 90s, basically, if you were a college educated parent, as long as you made sure your kids did their homework and did a few extracurricular activities, it's always good to know some music and to do some sports.
Right.
It just enriches you. That as long as you did that, then your kid would get into a good college, and that's all that mattered. Okay.
Mhm.
Then you got into, okay, so one thing, Caroline Hawksby, my colleague here at Hoover, uh, 30 years ago documented that the market for higher education evolved from a mostly local communities market. You just went to the college in your town to a national market, and it became very hierarchical. There was so much status and perceived benefit from going to the very best colleges there. So then that led to this increasing thing so that even the college educated parents said, I don't have any guarantee I can get my kid into a good college. And so then they felt like they had to put out much more effort. And that's what led us to this Rugrat race. It's a tournament. If you only have, say, fixed slots just for simplicity in college, then there's a tournament. You've got to beat the others to get your kid into those few slots at places like Stanford and Harvard.
So, how much of the Rugrat race is real, Valerie, versus imagined in this regard? There are a lot of great colleges in California. There are a lot of great colleges in America, but you also have a lot of people in this country who view college for their children as a statusy thing as a bragging right for themselves as parents. Remember Operation Varsity Blues a few years ago?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So what was that all about?
Yeah.
That was about very wealthy families in California paying a
Right.
lot of money to get colleges bribed, and their children, a lot of their children were really not terribly sharp. This is more about the parents and their egos. They wanted to brag that their kids went to Stanford or Georgetown or
Right.
USC. So that's my question here. How much of this is real versus how much is kind of in the parents' heads?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of it is in
Yeah.
the parents' heads. And there are studies going back and forth saying how much extra do you get? So kids who get into Stanford end up doing very well. But how much of that is Stanford's really good at identifying very talented children who will
Right.
do well no matter what? And some of the studies suggest that that's what most of it is. And others say, well, no, they do get extra benefits. So I can compare Stanford to UCSD. And, you just have a much higher faculty to student ratio at Stanford, and they
Right.
do get much more individualized attention than at UCSD. But I think at UCSD we did a great job, and particularly with kids who get in there who don't come from families with college backgrounds. I mean, I think UCSD's value added was probably higher than Stanford's, but Stanford still has value added. So particularly people who can afford it, one can say that that's worth it. But both of our children got great educations, our son at the private Stanford and our daughter at Berkeley. And in fact, when I was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, we brought the whole family. And then my daughter was so delighted how more Berkeley people got in than Stanford people. And so then she finally felt on par with her brother, because before she'd always been a little bit, oh, I went to Berkeley, I didn't go to Stanford. So
Yeah,
it
I
turned out.
just I find this line interesting because we live in what I would call a very performative age, Valerie. We post everything on social media to an excess. You really don't need to see what I had for dinner last night on social
Yeah,
media,
yeah,
but I don't put it on there, but some people do. And parents love to put college decals on their cars or walk around
yeah.
saying, I'm wearing a Stanford Mom ball cap or something like that. So again, I just wonder how much of this is real versus how much the parents are putting pressure on themselves to
Yeah.
ultimately feel better about themselves because I got little Johnny or little Susie into Stanford or into Berkeley.
Absolutely. And but they need to think about the cost of the Rugrat race. So back when we first published our paper in 2010, I was on several public radio broadcasts, and I remember in one case it was a family therapist there that was talking about real harms to the crazy lifestyle that parents had because they had their kids in all of these activities, way more than was probably good for anybody. But they felt this because of this Rugrat race to get into college.
Mhm. So in your study this earlier, you wrote, quote, the amount of time college educated women spent on childcare went up from 13 hours to 22 hours per week since the 1990s. What data do you have, if any, on dads?
Oh, I have quite a bit on dads, and I even looked at the most up to date.
I'm,
So,
I'm curious about this, Riley, because we have in
yeah,
modern parenting this phenomenon where, again, I'm going back to my primitive childhood in the 1960s and 70s, where dads did dad things. Dad and I would play catch.
Right.
Dad would take me to Little League, and mom did mom things with my sister, piano, things like that, ballet, and so forth. But I have this phenomenon where moms will be Little League moms and dads will be, girl dads. And so it seems we've become much more creative in our parenting.
Yeah, yes, we have, and that's a good thing. So right now, I looked at the last few years. So on average, a college-educated mother
Mhm.
uh, ha spends 21 hours a week on childcare. That's actually declined by 1 hour since the early 2000s. So I looked at that. That's college educated, non-college educated. They're still doing a lot, 18 hours. Um, college educated fathers are spending 13 hours, and that's much more than there used to be. That's gone up 2 hours even from 2003
Mhm.
2000 to 2005. For non-college, the fathers, now to be clear, these are fathers in the house.
Right.
So this is not counting the others. So these are fathers who are there. It's 10 hours for non-college, and there's been a 2 hour increase per week for them. So we are seeing fathers getting more involved over time, and that's good.
Okay,
One
let me
thing
be.
I've noticed, and it's great, the fathers playing with kids is just, that's one of the most enjoyable activities, but I think it's also a really important activity. So this is a high value activity, both for the parent and the child. But one thing I've noticed, and I just talking to other female economists, and our husbands just do a lot for our kids. They do the sports and all that. But much more often than not, the mother tends to be the household manager, right? It's the mother who has to remember that today is a field trip day, so you have to send a snack lunch bag, right?
Right.
And oh, today is pajama day at school, so you have to send your kid in pajamas. And just, all of those sorts of things. It's usually the mother that's remembering that. I mean, not complaining, but just that's how it works. Whereas the more optional kinds of things, not being driven by what the school is telling you to do, the fathers take over some of that. Yeah.
The best test is, Valerie, is get a dog for your family. Purely anecdotal, but anyone I know, every family I know that has gotten a dog, it becomes the mother's project ultimately. Why?
Oh,
Because the dog becomes kind of the extra child she didn't have, but the mom just kind of ends up having to clean up after the dog and train the dog to get off the sofa and kind of be the responsible one in terms the dad's there to have fun with the dog and play with the dog and walk the dog and roughhouse the dog, but the mom kind of takes it upon herself to really kind of raise the dog.
well, this is the intro. Actually, when I was growing up, my father was the dog person. He
Ah,
loved
okay.
animals.
Yeah.
And in our household, when our son went away to college and left us his cat, my husband did the cat box. And then also now we have a Chihuahua we've had for 10 years. And my husband does more for the Chihuahua than I love the Chihuahua too, but actually that's not the case there. So, but
Okay.
but but I can imagine that the average is what you say.
So here's a question for you, Valerie. We have this problem where we're not having enough kids in society. The good news, though, is what kids we are having in society, parents are devoting more time to them. But if you have more kids, doesn't that mean you have to thin out your time among the kids?
Yes, there is, but there are what economists call economies of scale, right?
Okay.
If everybody's there doing homework, you have the kids all at the dining room table doing their homework that you're managing. If you take them out on activities, you take all of them out, say to the zoo. So I don't think it's so much. Plus, I'm an only child of two only children, but I always hung out with my friends who were from baby boomer families with 4 to 6 people,
Right.
and there's just a lot that's conveyed by having siblings. I think so. So I think kids who are raised in families with siblings, even if they get a little bit less parental attention, they're getting plenty of benefits from having siblings. They learn from them, they enjoy them.
I think that's a great point too, especially ideally siblings who maybe so. But again, I have friends who've done this many different ways. Uh, Society, by the way, here in the Bay Area is fascinating, Valerie. So I always like to tell this story. Back when I had a chocolate lab and days where my house would be cleaned, I'd take the lab over to the nearby Nordstrom and sit in the courtyard and have a cup of coffee with the dog. Always amazes how many people gravitate toward the dog. They really are magnets, if you will. But I noticed a phenomenon that right before the Nordstrom doors would open, women in their 40s would show up and they were pushing a stroller, Valerie, and the stroller had twins in it, which suggested to me what? IVF. that,
Right,
you're
right.
doing that age. So different ways. But I think in terms of the kids here, and granted, I don't have kids of my own, so maybe I'm just talking out of school here. You want to have kids relatively close in age. Not necessarily, maybe not a year apart, maybe not
Yeah.
4 years apart, but somewhere around there. So they're kind of close together in terms of experiences, but not necessarily, caught up in the older one's shadow.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed this among all the families that the siblings that are closer in age are more likely to be closer, lifelong friends. So our kids are, what is it, 4.5 years apart, so a little bit too long, but we needed to get, as I said, we had our first one 2 years after I became an assistant professor, and then we both wanted to kind of lock in our 10-year portfolio before we had the second one. So that's why we took a little bit of a gap there.
Yeah, and I think especially if they're the same gender, it's an issue when you get to college. If I'm 2 years behind you as your sister in college or high school, excuse me, I am really, people know you, and so I'm
Yes.
being judged by you in large part. It's hard to develop your identity as a second child, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. But it's also, it's true, they expect things. But I was always envious of my best friend who had two older brothers, and if anybody was trying to bully, then they'd suddenly realize, oh, we know you, you're from the Barnes family, and then they kind of leave her alone. I thought, oh, I need a surrogate bigger brother.
Okay, so let's wrap this up, Valerie. So we've talked about a birth rate which has gone down to in the ones. It should be in the twos. Is it time to sound the alarm? Have we already sounded the alarm? But when do we get to really kind of crunch time and crisis time here?
Yeah, well, one can always turn these things around, right?
Right.
The real harms come if it continues, because then you have that compounding effect where the whole population just starts exponentially declining, and we have what one book called an empty planet. Um, so I think that culture is important. So I think that this coming into the culture, and certainly even people in the administration have been talking about this. You might get an increase in childbearing, and I think if people felt more confident about the economy, that would also help. So a
Okay.
good economy is probably good for fertility.
Okay, final question. What are the younger rabies doing? We know what the older rabies are doing for Valentine's Day. What are the younger rabies doing?
Yeah, so our son is married. He met his wife here at Stanford when they
Okay.
were freshmen. They're doing some kind of romantic thing. So our kid and our daughter is married to a fellow academic. So they're both academics, and they always do romantic things. I'm not quite sure what they are. We haven't asked yet. So
Okay, but they're helping the economy.
they're helping the economy. Oh, in terms of what they're doing, I thought you meant for Valentine's Day. No, our
Oh yeah.
son is an engineer. Our daughter-in-law is a dentist. They're up in the Seattle area, and our daughter and her husband are assistant professors of cognitive neuroscience at University of Arkansas. They were able to get a joint location is hard. That's one of the things I think that affects marriage, but they were able to get positions in the same university.
Okay. Well, Valerie, again, I congratulate you and your husband on winning the Rugrat race, and I hope your children likewise are victorious come the time when they turn their attention to this. Fun conversation, Valerie. Thanks for
All
doing
right.
this.
Thanks, Bill.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a podcast devoted to the discussion of policy research from the Hoover Institution, as well as issues of local, national, and geopolitical concern. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our show. And if you wouldn't mind, spread the word. Tell your friends about us. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is @HooverInst. That's spelled HOOVERINST. I encourage you to go back to the Hoover website, which is hoover.org, and sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, which keeps you updated on what Valerie Ramey and her Hoover colleagues are up to, and that's delivered to your inbox weekdays. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Matters of Policy and Politics. Hoover Senior Fellow Leo Haney and I talking about the latest political developments here in California. That's it for this podcast. Before I go, I'd like to thank my research assistant, Jack Patrick Magazine, for taking a data dive into Valentine's Day and population demographics. Thanks, JP. For the Hoover Institution, this is Bill Whalen. Till next time, take care. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.